Welcome to Lesson 3 in Making It Meaningful, Transition Assessment for Students Who are Deaf and Low Functioning. In Lesson 3, I'm going to provide a bit of an assessment refresher. And I will acknowledge that when I teach this information to my graduate and undergraduate students at Northern Illinois University, there's a bit of hesitation because it is dry material. On the other hand, I'm going to make the argument here that to appropriately assess students who are deaf and lower functioning, you really do need to understand some basics of standardized testing as well as some of the impacts as it relates to students who are deaf. Now, in our first segment, we're going to talk a little bit about the why are you testing? And the idea of why you're testing really relates to the idea of what are you doing? Your purpose. The purpose for testing should guide how the process unfolds. So are you looking at testing in terms of diagnosis? Are you looking at testing in terms of intervention or planning? Because that makes a lot of difference. And I will say, and this is an evolution on my part, I'm trained, my doctorate is in clinical psychology. And so I was strongly emphasized and trained on the idea of standardized testing, the importance of it, the value of it for moving the field forward, to move measurement forward. So I understand and appreciate standardized testing. On the other hand, I would say that I've also come to learn over the 30 years since I've been out of graduate school that approach has massive limitations for certain individuals, particularly individuals who are deaf and lower functioning. So I've evolved from an emphasis only on standardized testing to the idea that we really are talking about, let's think about planning and intervention, and there are some alternate ways of doing that. Because if we think about it, standardized testing from a diagnostic kind of a standpoint, we're really looking at it from the standpoint of deafness as a medical condition, as something that needs to be fixed. And when we do standardized testing, there's a lot of emphasis on classifying. Are you in this group or are you in this group? So the overall emphasis with traditional testing approaches, with standardized testing, is that we're looking at the individual and the impairment, but very little attention, very little awareness given to some of those broader characteristics and issues we talked about before, as far as social class, parents' involvement, available resources, and so forth. So diagnosis, while important, at this stage in the game, if we're talking about a deaf adolescent who's in the transition age, my sense is that he or she has already had a lot of diagnostic kinds of workups already done with them. When we think about assessment, we also talk about it in terms of more formal versus informal. The formal would be the standardized assessment, as we've talked about. The informal is more what I'm going to emphasize, and that's the use of interviews, ratings, observations. So as we move into our next segment, we're going to talk about features of standardized tests. And when we talk about that, I'm going to talk about it, again, this is not just a deafness issue. This is things you need to know when you're using tests or when you're trying to understand tests. So the three things that I'm going to emphasize most directly as we talk about this have to do with how tests are administered, the nature of the scores you get, and then the idea of, and who do you compare your scores with? All right, the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of standardization. Standardization is a fundamental principle of test delivery. It's the idea that when I'm administering a test, I have to administer it the same way to Susie as I administer it to Bill, as I administer it to John, to any student that I might give it to. The expectation is that they will get the same presentation. Now, while that works really, really well, and it's incredibly valuable if we're talking about testing people who don't have disabilities, so that if I know that you can understand what I'm saying, you can see me, so on and so forth, then that idea of standardization is really critical. If, however, we think about it, step back a moment and think about this idea of standard administration, well, how does that work for somebody who has a disability, who may have a motor issue or may have a vision issue, or importantly, for someone who's deaf? The vast, vast majority of standardized tests out there don't address that. They are designed for people who are otherwise non-disabled. We have no idea what the impact is of disability as it relates to this type of testing. Now, reliability. When I talk about these next two slides, we're going to talk about reliability and validity. When I do that in class, the students' eyes tend to glaze over. And I will tell you the first time that I heard these concepts, it was as though someone were speaking a foreign language to me. It didn't make much sense. So I'm going to try to make it as straightforward and as direct as possible. So the first thing we're going to talk about has to do with reliability. So when we're talking about a score, when you've given a test, reliability relates to the consistency of that score, okay? So the consistency of that score is, would we get the same answer, the same response, whether it's given by one person or another, whether it's given in one setting or another? Consistency in many ways is very, very, very important. Now, when we think about it as relates to someone who's deaf, how do you ensure consistency if the evaluator, for example, doesn't know sign language, or if an interpreter is used, or if they pantomime instructions? We have no idea, we don't know how that might affect the reliability of the measure. And the other part of that too is while reliability is first and foremost, it's not the only thing that's important. The one thing that is important to remember, however, is that unreliable tests, if you can't be consistent, that's the end of it. That we don't really need to worry about it anymore, because if it's not reliable, then it can't be valid. The other part about, as we think about reliability as a concept, not only is it the consistency of the scores over time, but it's the idea that in the long run, that the scores must mean something, right? And that the meaning has to do with validity. So let me give you a quick example of what I mean by that. If, for example, I weigh myself, all right? So every morning I step on the scale, I weigh myself, I look down, oh my goodness, 140 pounds. Now every day I step on that scale, 140 pounds. Now who would imagine, right? Now, reliable? Absolutely. Every morning I step on the scale, it weighs me at 140 pounds. Now, does that 140 pounds, is it accurate? Does it mean anything? Of course not. I mean, I'm significantly over 140 pounds. So understand that we first have to establish reliability, the consistency, but our next step is to look at, does it mean anything? And so validity is this idea of looking at the test's usefulness. Does it provide the kind of information that we want? So as you can probably guess from what I've talked about so far, the idea is that you have to first demonstrate reliability, then you can talk about whether it's valid, whether it has meaning. Another feature of standardized tests that I want to emphasize is the idea of norm groups. So if we think about it so far, we've said standardization is an issue. We've talked about reliability and validity as issues. But then once you have a score, you're supposed to compare it to another group. So again, if you're not disabled, and even historically, norm groups were typically white, middle class. We've expanded them to have broader range of gender, age, socioeconomic class. But even so, the idea with having a norm group is you compare a score against another group and see where did that person perform. And you can imagine that the more different you are from the norm group, the less valuable the comparison is. So if a student who is deaf gets evaluated using procedures that aren't helpful for communication, that we have questionable scores from it, and then you take those scores and you compare it to this norm group, this bell curve, if you would, of people who weren't deaf, how does any of that make sense and how does it fit? So the idea of norm groups for people who are deaf is problematic, particularly from the standpoint also of the diversity among the group. So, as we talked about earlier, the age of onset, the causes, so on and so forth, there is huge diversity among people who are deaf. So how would you even establish an appropriate norm group? Now I'd like to move into the third segment, where I talk a little bit about the pros and cons of functional assessment. Excuse me. I'd like to move into the third segment where we talk about the pros and cons of standardized assessment. Excuse me. Now, again, being a psychologist, being trained in this, I will say that standardized tests really do have a lot of value to them. They're important for helping us gather information, for diagnosis, for classification. That idea of uniform administration, while that may be problematic for students who are deaf, for the broader population is a really helpful thing. And the other thing that people really like about standardized tests is that they provide scores, quantifiable scores that you can use to compare and work with others. Now, if we talk about this in terms of benefits, we also need to talk about it in terms of limitations. One of the major limitations to standardized testing, and this goes for everyone, not just people who are deaf or otherwise disabled, is that a standardized test takes a snapshot of behavior. We're looking at an individual's performance at a particular moment in time. All right? And so it's a particular moment in time, a particular sample of behavior. So it's really, truly just a snapshot. We don't have a bigger picture of how the person behaves. Standardized testing really, if it emphasizes this diagnostic classification kind of focus, it really doesn't allow us much in terms of help for transition planning. And then the third limitation as it relates to standardized testing is generalization. And for any of us who do clinical work, you certainly have that. What they do in the classroom, what they do in the clinic may not necessarily generalize to what they do in real life. And that issue of does it work from the clinic or classroom into real life is certainly a major issue for many of us. The other thing I would note as we're ending this particular segment has to do with how you interpret results. Because interpreting results, there are multiple ways of doing it. I talked about earlier the idea of a norm group, okay? And with standardized assessment, that's very common that you compare your score against a norm group. Another way of looking at standardized assessment, however, is a criterion. Here's a certain level of performance behaviors that you're supposed to hit, and do you address that? It'd be kind of like how you think of perhaps the Common Core things, that there's certain limits, and do you meet or exceed those, all right? So I'm not going to get into score interpretation. That could be another workshop in and of itself. But I would, however, and this is a very significant point here, and I put it on the slide here. It's a cautionary note. And the cautionary note is this: don't rely on any one item or subtest to qualify a student for services. I've seen this happen many, many times, that someone gives an evaluation and a student just makes a cutoff by 1 or 2 points, or just misses a cutoff by 1 or 2 points, and so here's our proof. Well, particularly as we're talking about students who are deaf and low functioning, I would encourage you never rely on just a single test or item, subtest if you would, or item to classify a student, because getting a broader range of information about them is going to be ever so much more helpful and valuable. So in summary, as we look at this particular lesson, one, to emphasize the idea of why. That why guides the process of doing assessment. This is, whether we're trying to diagnose someone or classify them, then that requires one type of an approach. If we're talking about doing assessment that is more for intervention or planning, that gives us yet another approach to this. And then we talked about standardized testing and mentioned the idea of the values of it as far as diagnosis and classification. The idea of quantification, that it gives numbers and people really like numbers. Limitations have to do with the idea of it's only a snapshot of behavior. There are many things that we might look at that it doesn't address. And also, can you take these results and generalize them to the real world? All right, so that's it for lesson 3. We'll move into lesson 4 in a moment, and in lesson 4, we're going to focus much more directly on how deafness affects the assessment experience.